March 5. Joseph Stalin dies. He has ruled the Soviet Union for roughly 25 years. In that time, the country industrialized at a speed without precedent in economic history, won the largest land war ever fought, and killed through famine, purge, forced labor, and deliberate terror somewhere between 6 and 20 million of its own citizens. The range of that estimate is itself a statement about what the Soviet state did to the historical record. The archives were sealed. The numbers were classified. The demographers who tried to count were themselves arrested. The men standing at his beer barrier, Malenko, Khrushchev, Molotov, have each spent the previous decade navigating a system in which any of them could have been killed at any moment on any charge. Not for opposing the government, not for treason in the ordinary sense, for being on the wrong side of history. Capital H. History is an active force, a direction, a destination, a verdict that had already been written, the inevitable future that Marx had identified, that Lenin had accelerated, that Stalin had claimed to be building, the end point toward which all human development was scientifically determined to move. This is the framework this episode is about. Not Marxism as economic analysis, though it is that. Not Leninism as political strategy, though it is that too. The specific claim underneath both of them. The claim that made the Soviet project different from ordinary political ideology. That made its failures systematically unreformable and its internal enemies systematically killable. The claim that the revolution was not a choice, that it was not a policy, that it was the scientific conclusion of the laws of history as inevitable as the orbit of planets or the cooling of stars. Science as prophecy, prophecy as science. That claim is what this episode is about, and it begins not in Russia. Not in 1917, but in a reading room in London, in the 1840s, with a German philosopher who was absolutely certain he had discovered the law that governed everything. He was right that the world needed changing. He was wrong that he had found a law. The difference between those two things, between an analysis and a law, between a political program and a prophecy, is the difference between a framework that can learn from its failures and one that must explain them away. The Soviet Union spent 70 years explaining them away. Before going further, the same thing that has been said in every episode this season needs to be said here and with particular force. Because this is the case where the temptation to collapse moral distinctions is strongest in both directions. The Soviet Union produced genuine achievements: industrialization, mass literacy, universal education extended to populations that had never had access to it, the defeat of Nazi Germany, scientific and technical programs that were real and significant. The people who built those things were often people of genuine idealism who believed in the project and paid real costs for that belief. The Soviet Union also produced the Gulag, the Ukrainian famine, the Great Terror, a systematic destruction of entire categories of people defined as enemies of history. Often the same people did both. That is not a paradox that resolves cleanly. It is the actual history, and it is, as this episode will argue, exactly what you would expect from a framework that had made itself impossible to question. Karl Marx was born in Trier, in what is now Germany. In 1818, his father was a lawyer. He was educated in law and philosophy. Brilliant from the beginning, and possessed from early in his intellectual life of a quality that his friends found inspiring and his critics found insufferable: absolute certainty that he had understood something everyone else had missed. He'd also seen something that was genuinely difficult to miss. If you were paying attention in Europe in the 1840s, the world was changing faster than anyone had words for. Cities that had been small market towns 2 generations earlier were now factory cities of hundreds of thousands of people, with no sanitation, no labor protections, no social floor beneath the people who worked in them. Children worked 14-hour days in textile mills. Families lived in single rooms in buildings designed for animals. The wealth being created was real and visible. The people creating it were not benefiting from it. Marx looked at this and asked the question that the political economy of his time was not asking. Not how do we manage this, but why does it work this way? What is the structure beneath the surface? His answer was historical materialism. The idea is simpler than it sounds, and simpler than Marx made it. Every society has to produce what it needs to survive: food, shelter, tools, goods. The way it organizes that production: who owns the land, the factories, the machines, what relationships of power that ownership creates between people. This is the base. Everything else, the laws, the government, the religion, the culture, the family structure is superstructure. It reflects and reinforces the base. When the base changes, the superstructure changes with it. Whether the people inside it want it to or not. The king does not rule because God appointed him. The king rules because the economic organization of his society produces a structure of power in which someone like him ends up at the top. Change the economic organization and the king goes away, not because of a revolution in ideas, but because the material ground beneath him has shifted. This was the claim, and as a way of understanding history, it was and remains a genuinely powerful tool. The problem was what Marx did with it next. Marx did not present historical materialism as an analytical lens, a way of asking useful questions about history that might illuminate things that other approaches missed. He presented it as a law. Human history, in his framework, had moved through a series of necessary stages, each defined by a mode of production and the class structure it generated. Slave societies gave way to feudal societies. Feudal societies gave way to capitalist societies. And capitalist societies, the world Marx was living in, would give way to socialist societies, and then to communist ones, in which the class contradictions that had driven history would finally be resolved, because there would be no more classes. This was not a prediction in the ordinary sense, not a guess, or a hope, or a political program dressed as analysis. It was, Marx insisted, the conclusion of rigorous examination of historical evidence. The same kind of conclusion Darwin had drawn about biological evolution. The same kind Newton had drawn about physical motion. The laws of history were as real as the laws of nature. They pointed in one direction. The direction was forward. The destination was communism. And the revolutionary moment, the point at which the working class would seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie, was not something that could be prevented. It could be delayed. It could be accelerated. But it could not be stopped, any more than the orbit of the Earth could be stopped, because it was the operation of a law. Here is the problem with that claim. A genuine scientific law is falsifiable. You can, in principle, identify evidence that would prove it wrong. If I tell you that objects fall at a rate determined by gravitational acceleration, you can test that. You can drop things. You can measure. You can, in theory, find a result that would require revising the law. Marx's historical law was not falsifiable in this sense. A successful revolution confirmed the law. A failed revolution confirmed that the conditions were not yet ripe. Capitalist prosperity was a phase before the inevitable collapse. Working-class conservatism was false consciousness, the temporary effect of bourgeois ideology obscuring real interests. Every setback was a delay, not a refutation. Every failure was evidence that the enemies of the revolution were more resourceful than expected, which meant the revolution needed to push harder. not reconsider its premises. Notice the structure. It is the same structure this season is traced in every episode. The Mahdi's follows absorbed military defeat as a test of faith. The Taiping absorbed the massacre of their own leadership as divine purification. The Soviet framework absorbed every failure of the revolution to produce the promised future as evidence that the enemies of history were working against it, which meant the revolution needed to push harder. The difference, and this is what makes the Soviet case distinct from all the others, is that Marx's framework did not present itself as prophecy. It presented itself as science. You can argue with a prophet. You can say, I do not accept this man's claim to divine authority. I do not believe he received a vision. The rejection is available to you. You cannot argue with physics when the prophetic claim is scientific. Disagreement is not heresy. It is irrationality. It is, in the vocabulary that Soviet Marxism would eventually develop, being objectively on the wrong side of history regardless of your subjective intentions, regardless of what you thought you were doing. Objectively, that word would do an enormous amount of work in the decades to come. Marx spent much of his adult life in London, in poverty that was real and sometimes severe, the kind of poverty that coexisted with particular bitterness, alongside a daily walk to one of the great libraries of the world, where he read the economics of the system that was keeping him poor and worked on the book that would explain why it was doing so. 3 of his children died in infancy. His family was frequently evicted for non-payment of rent. Friedrich Engels, his collaborator, his intellectual equal in most respects, and the son of a factory owner, provided the financial support that kept Marx alive and working. The irony of the great theorist of capitalism being sustained by a capitalist was one that Marx critics noted, and Marx himself appears to have found less amusing than they did. He wrote with the relentlessness of someone who believed he was working against a deadline set by history itself. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, combined the analytical framework of historical materialism with the political urgency of a revolutionary moment that Marx believed had arrived. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. The opening sentence is a thesis, a historical claim, and a battle cry, all at once. The revolutions of 1848 failed. The working class did not seize power in England, France, or Germany. The capitalist order that Marx had diagnosed as terminally ill recovered, adapted, and continued. Marx spent the next decades in the reading room, refining the analysis, extending the framework, adding complexity to the timeline while maintaining the directional claim. He died in 1883, in London, without having seen the revolution he had predicted. He had been wrong about the timing, wrong about where it would happen. He expected England, the most industrially developed capitalist society, not agrarian Russia. Wrong about the mechanism. The revolutionary moment he anticipated did not arrive through the inexorable operation of economic laws alone, but the framework survived him, and the people who inherited it did not experience its failures of prediction as reasons to question the framework. They experienced them as problems of timing and application, evidence that the revolutionary moment required not only the right conditions but the right organization, the right party, the right leadership, the right vanguard. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin was born in Simbirsk, in the Russian Empire, in 1870. His older brother Alexander was executed in 1887 for involvement in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Lenin was 17. The execution shaped him in ways that he rarely discussed directly, but that the people who knew him well described as foundational. The specific knowledge, absorbed young, that the system he was living in would kill the people he loved, and that the question was not whether to fight it but how. By the time he was in his 20s, he had absorbed the Marxist framework deeply enough that it was in the accounts of people who knew him. Less something he believed than something he inhabited, the lens through which all experience was organized, the vocabulary in which all problems were stated and all solutions proposed. His specific contribution to that framework was a theory of the party. The problem Lenin was addressing was real and worth taking seriously before seeing where the solution led. Marx had predicted that the working class would develop revolutionary consciousness through its own experience of industrial capitalism, that the daily experience of exploitation would eventually produce the political understanding required for revolution. But 1900. This had not happened. The largest working class movements in the most developed capitalist countries, Britain, Germany, France, were pursuing trade union goals: better wages, shorter hours, improved conditions. Not revolution. Lenin's diagnosis: left to develop its own political consciousness. The working class would arrive only at what he called trade union consciousness, awareness of its immediate economic interests, but not the theoretical understanding of its own historical role. The solution: a vanguard party, an organization of professional revolutionaries, disciplined, hierarchically organized, committed to the framework with total dedication, whose function was to bring revolutionary consciousness to the working class from outside, to be the custodian of the theory, to know where history was going and lead the class there. This argument, What is to be Done, published in 1902, is one of the most consequential political documents of the 20th century. Not because its organizational prescriptions were novel, because of what it did to the relationship between the framework and political authority. In Marx's original formulation, the party was a vehicle for the working class's own self-organization, an expression of the class's political will. In Lenin's formulation, the party was the custodian of historical truth, the organization that understood the laws of history better than the class whose liberation those laws foretold. The party knew where history was going. The working class needed to be led there. This is the hinge. Once the party is the custodian of historical truth, once it is the organization entitled to lead the class in whose name it speaks, the relationship between the party and dissent becomes structurally different. Disagreement with the party is not merely a political difference. It is a failure to grasp historical reality. And people who are objectively wrong about the direction of history are not just political opponents. They are obstacles. Russia, in 1917, was not the country Marx had expected to produce the first socialist revolution. It was, by the measures Marx had used, industrial development, size of the working class, degree of capitalist development, one of the least likely candidates, predominantly agrarian, a small industrial working class concentrated in a few cities, governed by an autocracy that was simultaneously repressive and incompetent, fighting a war that had already killed millions of its soldiers and was destroying whatever remained of the dynasty's legitimacy. The Tsarist system was collapsing. The question was not whether it would fall, but what would replace it. The Bolsheviks, Lenin's party, disciplined and in possession of a framework that told them exactly what the moment required, were not the largest or most popular of the revolutionary parties. The socialist revolutionaries had a larger base in the peasantry. The Mensheviks were more numerous in some regions. The provisional government that had replaced the Tsar in February had broader institutional support. But the Bolsheviks had the framework, and the framework told them that the moment had arrived, that the laws of history had produced the conditions for revolution, and that what was required was not caution or coalition building. What was required was the seizure of power. Now, by the party that understood what history demanded. In October 1917, they seized it. A sealed train from Switzerland had brought Lenin back to Russia in April, arranged by the German government, which correctly calculated that Lenin would destabilize Russia's war effort. He arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd at night, stepped onto the platform, and told the crowd that had gathered, "The worldwide socialist revolution has begun." He had been in exile for 17 years. He believed it. The October Revolution was, by the standards of the theory that justified it, premature. Lenin knew this. The Menshevik Marxists who opposed the Bolshevik seizure of power knew this. Even some Bolsheviks knew this. Kamenev and Zinoviev, two of Lenin's most senior colleagues, opposed the uprising on the specific grounds that the conditions Marx had identified as prerequisites for a successful socialist revolution were not yet present in Russia. The working class was too small. The peasantry, the majority of the population, had not been incorporated into the revolutionary movement in any stable way. The revolution in Western Europe that was supposed to follow and sustain the Russian one had not happened. The premature revolution was the revolution Lenin made anyway. His justification was both tactical and theoretical. Tactically, the window was open. The provisional government was collapsing. The moment would not come again. Theoretically, the imperialist war had accelerated the contradictions of capitalism. The weakest link in the chain had broken first, and the task now was to hold on until the rest of the chain followed. The rest of the chain did not follow. The German Revolution of 1918-19 was suppressed. The Hungarian Soviet Republic lasted 133 days. The revolutionary wave that Lenin had counted on to sustain the Russian Revolution receded, and the Bolsheviks found themselves governing a vast, exhausted, predominantly peasant country, with a theory of history that said this should not have happened, and the urgent practical problem of what to do next. The Civil War of 1918-1921 is where the relationship between the revolutionary framework and political violence was established in forms that would define the Soviet state for decades. The Reds against the Whites, the new Soviet state against the armies of the old regime, foreign intervention, peasant uprisings, famine, a country tearing itself apart while the government in Petrograd, then Moscow, tried to hold it together with the instruments available to it, and the most available instrument in a revolutionary state with an ideology that divided the population into historical allies and historical enemies was force. War communism, the economic policy of the Civil War period, involved the forced requisitioning of grain from the peasantry to feed the Red Army and the urban working class. Peasants who resisted were designated class enemies, kulaks. The supposedly prosperous peasants whom the framework identified as the rural bourgeoisie, whose resistance was therefore not merely disobedience but objective class antagonism. Here is where the framework's specific logic begins to do damage. The category kulak was, from the beginning, more ideological than empirical. In practice, it was applied to any peasant who resisted grain requisitioning, regardless of actual wealth or class position. But the framework provided the vocabulary, and the vocabulary provided the justification not for repression in the ordinary sense, but for the elimination of a class, which was a different and more encompassing claim. This is one of the specific mechanisms by which the Soviet framework made violence systematic rather than episodic. When your opponents are not merely politically wrong, but objectively on the wrong side of history, the violence directed at them is not repression. It is the operation of historical law. It is the revolution doing what revolutions, in the Marxist framework, necessarily do, resolving the class contradictions that had generated the old order, clearing the ground for the new one. The Cheka, the secret police established in December 1917, within weeks of the revolution, was, in this framework, not a political terror apparatus in the ordinary sense. It was the instrument by which the revolution defended itself against the objective enemies of history. Its first head, Felix Dzerzhinsky, understood it in exactly these terms. The revolution was not conducting arbitrary violence. It was conducting historically necessary violence. The distinction mattered enormously to the people making it. Whether it mattered to the people dying is a different question. Lenin died in January 1924. After a series of strokes that had removed him from active politics since 1922, the question of who would succeed him was not resolved by the framework, because the framework had nothing to say about how the custodian of historical truth should be selected when the current custodian could no longer function. The party that claimed to embody the scientific laws of history had no scientific mechanism for its own leadership transition. What it had was what every institution without a succession rule has: a power struggle. Lenin's own final writings, the documents collected and suppressed as his testament, expressed concern about the concentration of power in specific individuals, including explicit reservations about Stalin. Lenin described him as having accumulated too much power and being insufficiently careful about how he used it. The recommendation was to remove Stalin from his position as General Secretary. The recommendation was not implemented. Stalin, Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili, born in Georgia in 1878, the son of a cobbler, educated in a seminary before his conversion to revolutionary Marxism, was not, in 1924, the most intellectually distinguished of the party's senior leaders. Trotsky was more brilliant. Bukharin was more theoretically sophisticated. Zinoviev and Kamenev had longer revolutionary histories and deeper connections within the movement. What Stalin had was an understanding of the party apparatus, its structures, its personnel, its internal dynamics that none of the others had bothered to develop. He had spent the years of Lenin's illness accumulating organizational power through his position as General Secretary, appointing loyalists to key positions, building a network of obligation and dependence that the more intellectually prominent figures had not taken seriously enough to counter. They thought he was a mediocrity. They were wrong about what kind of ability the moment required. By 1929, Stalin had outmaneuvered all of them. Trotsky was in exile. Zinoviev and Kamenev had been expelled from the party. Bukharin, the last significant internal opposition, was being prepared for removal. Before getting to what Stalin did with the power he had accumulated, it is worth sitting with what the Soviet framework had already established by the end of the 1920s, what it had built into the institutional structure of the state in ways that would constrain every subsequent leader, including the ones who tried to reform it. The framework had established that the party was the custodian of historical truth, not a custodian among others, the custodian, the authoritative interpreter of the laws of history, the organization whose understanding of the revolutionary moment was correct by definition, because the party's theoretical foundations were scientific, and scientific foundations were not subject to democratic revision. This meant that the relationship between the party and internal dissent was structurally different from the relationship between a normal political party and its internal critics. Inside a normal political party, dissent is inconvenient, but legitimate. The dissenters might be right, and even if they are wrong, the cost of allowing them to make their case is low. Inside a party that is the custodian of historical truth, sustained dissent is not merely inconvenient, it is incoherent. Either the party's understanding of history is correct, in which case the dissenters are objectively wrong and their persistence is damaging, or the dissenters are right, in which case the entire foundation of the party's authority is false. There is no stable middle position. The framework had also established that the revolution was always under threat from enemies who were not always visible as enemies. The class enemy did not announce itself. The kulak did not wear a sign. The deviationist did not come with a warning label. The enemies of history were often, in the framework's account, people who appeared to be allies, who used the vocabulary of the revolution, who had good records of service, but who were, objectively, working against the revolution's historical mission. This meant that surveillance was not merely a security measure. It was an epistemological necessity. You could not know who was objectively on the wrong side of history by looking at them or listening to what they said. You had to investigate. You had to examine. You had to be willing to conclude that someone who had served the revolution for 20 years was nonetheless, in the final analysis, an enemy of it. These structural features were in place before Stalin. Stalin did not create them. What he did was take them to their logical conclusion. The new economic policy, the NEP of the 1920s, was a tactical retreat from the ambitions of war communism. Lenin had authorized a partial restoration of market mechanisms. Peasants could sell their surplus on the open market. Small private businesses could operate. The economy could stabilize after the devastation of the Civil War. The NEP produced real economic recovery. Life in Soviet cities in the mid-1920s was, by the standards of the Civil War years, almost normal. It also produced, by the late 1920s, the specific problem that would define the next decade. The peasantry, 80% of the Soviet population, was feeding the country and generating the agricultural surplus the state needed to finance industrialization. But the peasantry was doing this on its own terms, in response to market incentives, in a way that gave it a degree of economic independence from the state. This independence was, in the framework's vocabulary, a class problem. The peasantry was not the proletariat. Its interests were not the interests of the revolution. Its relationship to the land was a form of private property. And private property was the foundation of the capitalist relations that the revolution had come to abolish. The question of what to do about the peasantry, how to extract the agricultural surplus needed for industrialization without restoring the market mechanisms that the framework identified as bourgeois, was the question Stalin answered in 1929 with a single word: collectivization. What that word meant in practice, what it cost, who paid, and how the framework explained the price is what Hoi 3 is about. In 1929, Stalin announced the collectivization of Soviet agriculture. The decision was not a departure from the revolutionary framework. It was, in Stalin's own account and in the account of many of the party officials who implemented it, a logical completion of the revolution's unfinished business. The NEP had been a tactical retreat, a temporary accommodation with market forces. The peasantry needed to be incorporated into the socialist mode of production. Private landholding needed to be dissolved. Agricultural production needed to be organized into collective farms and subordinated to state planning. This was what the framework required. What happened over the next several years was not what the framework predicted. The peasantry resisted. Not uniformly. Not everywhere. Not always violently, but significantly and persistently enough that the state's response moved beyond persuasion into coercion. And beyond coercion into something that does not have a comfortable name. Peasants who resisted collectivization were designated kulaks and subjected to dekulakization, deportation to labor camps, execution, or forced settlement in remote regions. The category of kulak expanded as resistance persisted, until it encompassed not just the prosperous peasants the original definition had targeted, but any peasant who opposed the process at all. A category that began as a class designation became, in practice, a label for anyone in the way. Between 1930 and 1933. Collectivization, combined with the state's extraction of grain from regions where the harvest had failed, produced a famine that killed. Estimates vary, and the Soviet archives were sealed for decades, somewhere between 5 and 8 million people. The majority of the deaths were in Ukraine, where the famine is known as the Holodomor, the death by hunger. Whether the Ukrainian famine was a deliberate act of genocide against the Ukrainian people specifically, or a consequence of policies that killed people across multiple regions without specific ethnic targeting, is a question historians have debated seriously, and that different states have reached different legal conclusions about. What is not seriously disputed the scale of the death, the fact that the state knew grain was being extracted from regions where people were starving, and the fact that the state continued the extractions. Grain left Ukraine on trains. People in Ukraine died. Both things happened at the same time. The framework's relationship to this catastrophe is what this episode is most specifically about, and it requires being stated directly. The framework could not acknowledge the famine as a failure of the framework. It could acknowledge failures of implementation, individual officials who had been too harsh, or not harsh enough, or who had misunderstood the correct pace of collectivization. Stalin himself, in a famous 1930 article titled "Dizzy with Success," criticized local officials for excessive coercion, a criticism that served the political purpose of providing a scapegoat for the disorder while maintaining the correctness of the policy itself. But the policy collectivization, the elimination of private agriculture, the subordination of the peasantry to state planning could not be reconsidered, because the policy was the application of the framework, and the framework was scientific law. To acknowledge that collectivization had produced a catastrophe was to open the possibility that the framework's diagnosis of the peasant question had been wrong, which was to open the possibility that other elements of the question framework were also wrong, which was to undermine the foundation of the party's authority. The framework required a different explanation, and the framework provided one. The famine was not the consequence of the policy. The famine was the consequence of sabotage by the kulaks who had slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender them to collective farms, by the local officials who had misimplemented correct policies, by the foreign agents who were working to undermine socialist construction, by the hidden enemies within the party itself who were, objectively, working against the revolution while appearing to serve it. This explanation was not a cynical fabrication in the sense of something the leadership privately knew to be false. It was the explanation that the framework made available, and the explanation that the framework made necessary. A scientific law that has produced the wrong outcome requires either a revision of the law or an explanation of why the law was correctly applied, but the outcome was distorted by external interference. The Soviet framework provided this second option in abundance. The enemies were always there. They were always sabotaging. They were always harder to identify than expected, more deeply embedded than anticipated, more numerous than the previous investigation had suggested. And if the enemies were always more numerous than expected, the only logical conclusion was that the investigation needed to go further. The Great Terror of 1936, 1938, is where this logic reached its most extreme expression. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had been in power for nearly a decade. The collectivization campaign had been completed, at enormous cost. The first 2 5-year plans had produced real industrialization the Soviet Union had built in a decade. An industrial base that had taken capitalist economies generations. The external threat was real and growing. Nazi Germany had been in power since 1933, and its intentions toward the Soviet Union were not ambiguous. Into this moment, in December 1934, came the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party boss. Popular and powerful, possibly a rival to Stalin, killed by a single gunman in a corridor of the Smolny Institute. The circumstances of Kirov's murder have never been fully explained. The historical evidence that Stalin arranged it is significant but not conclusive. What is documented is what happened afterward. Stalin used the assassination to justify an investigation that expanded systematically, with his personal involvement at key moments, until it had consumed most of the old Bolshevik leadership, the men and women who had made the revolution, who had built the party, who had known Lenin personally and therefore possessed a standard of comparison for what the Soviet Union was supposed to be. Zinoviev and Kamenev tried publicly, confessing in detail to crimes they had not committed. Executed in 1936. Piatakov and Radek, tried in 1937. Confessing. Piatakov executed. Radek dying in a labor camp. Tukhachevsky and most of the senior Red Army leadership tried in June 1937. Executed within days. The Red Army lost 3 of its 5 marshals in a single year. Bukharin, the last of the great old Bolsheviks. The man Lenin had called the favorite of the whole party. Tried in March 1938. Confessing. Executed. The numbers do not stop there. The party lost hundreds of thousands of members. The secret police, the NKVD, was itself purged. Its leadership executed and replaced. The new leadership then purged in turn. The Red Army lost. Between 1,937 and 1,938. Approximately 35,000 officers at various levels of seniority. A state was eating its own most experienced people in the name of protecting itself from enemies. The show trials, the public confessions, the theatrical proceedings in which men with decades of revolutionary service admitted to monstrous crimes are among the most studied and most disturbing events of the 20th century. The confessions were, in almost every case, false. The crimes were invented. The methods used to produce them ranged from sleep deprivation and psychological pressure to physical torture, and varied by interrogator and by the specific needs of each case. But the confessions were also, in a specific sense, coherent from inside the framework. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, published in 1940 and based on his understanding of what had happened to the old Bolsheviks, is one of the great literary explorations of this logic. The novel's central character, Rubashov, a composite of the old Bolsheviks, confesses not because he has been broken in the ordinary sense, but because the framework he has inhabited his entire adult life provides no alternative. If the party is the custodian of historical truth, and the party has determined that he is guilty, then his subjective conviction of innocence is simply false consciousness, the last refuge of a man who cannot accept that the historical process has passed him by. His job, as a revolutionary, is to serve the revolution, and the revolution, in this moment, requires his confession. Koestler's Rubashov signs the confession, goes to his death, believing, in some final register, that this is what the framework demands of him. The accounts that survived from the real old Bolsheviks in fragments, in letters smuggled out, in the testimonies of people who were eventually released, suggest that this was not entirely fiction, that some of the men who confessed had indeed arrived. Through some combination of torture and the internal logic of a framework they had spent their lives inside, at the conclusion that the party's verdict was more reliable than their own account of their actions. This is the most disturbing thing the Soviet case has to show us. Not the cynicism, the sincerity. The Gulag, the system of labor camps that had been established in the early Soviet period and expanded significantly under Stalin, held, at its peak in the late 1940s, somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million prisoners at any given moment. This figure does not include the millions who passed through the system over its history, or released, or died in it. The total number of people who experienced the Gulag system as prisoners, as family members of prisoners, as people deported to special settlements runs into the tens of millions. Anne Applebaum's Gulag, A History, published in 2003 after the Soviet archives were opened, reconstructed the system in detail from the documents the Soviet state had kept about itself, the administrative records of a bureaucracy that processed human beings with the same organizational thoroughness it applied to grain, quotas, and steel production. The camps were not secret in the sense of being unknown to the population. Their existence was widely understood. What was not understood from outside was their scale and what was not permitted. From inside was any public acknowledgement of what they were. This is the specific epistemological achievement of the Soviet framework in its mature form, not that it prevented people from knowing what was happening, but that it prevented people from saying what they knew. The knowledge was private, the performance was public, and the gap between the two was maintained for decades by the understanding not always stated, but always present of what happened to people who closed the gap in the wrong direction. It is also necessary to say, because this episode has committed to holding complexity honestly, that the Soviet Union during these same years was doing other things. Literacy rates rose dramatically across the 1930s, reaching populations that had never had access to education. Women entered the workforce and the professions in numbers that had no parallel in contemporaneous Western societies. The industrialization drive, brutal as its human cost, was produced a country that could build the T-34 tank, the weapons system that eventually stopped the German advance at Stalingrad and Kursk. Without the industrial base built in the 5-year plans, it is not obvious that the Soviet Union survives the German invasion of 1941. And if the Soviet Union does not survive, the history of the 20th century is different in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. The same state that ran Kolyma also won the Second World War. The same framework that justified the Gulag also mobilized the industrial effort that defeated Nazi Germany. These things were happening simultaneously, produced by the same system, and they cannot be separated by assigning the achievements to genuine socialism and the crimes to Stalinist distortion. They came from the same source. A framework that could not acknowledge its failures was also a framework that could mobilize enormous human energy in pursuit of specific goals, because it had eliminated the doubt and the negotiation and the accommodation that more open systems require. The energy was real. The mobilization was real. The cost was paid by people who had no say in whether the price was worth it. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet framework had produced something that none of its founders had anticipated. A socialist state in which the working class had less political power than it possessed in the most developed capitalist democracies. A party that claimed to speak for history and had become a mechanism for the personal tyranny of one man. A scientific law that was supposed to point toward human liberation and was being used to justify the systematic killing of the people who had made the revolution. The framework had absorbed every one of these outcomes without revising itself. The working class's lack of political power, a temporary necessity of the transition period. The party's internal violence, the revolution defending itself against hidden enemies. Stalin's tyranny, the will of history finding its necessary instrument. The gap between what the framework promised and what it was producing was, by the late 1930s, very wide. But the framework had an explanation for the gap that did not require revising the framework. The enemies were there. They were just not yet all identified. Every expansion of the investigation had found more of them. The logical conclusion was that the next expansion would find more still. There was no internal mechanism that could stop this. No way, from inside the framework, to say we have gone far enough. The framework did not have a concept of far enough. It had a concept of historical necessity, and the historical necessity, in the Soviet framework, had no ceiling. Stalin died in March 1953, and the Soviet Union survived him by 38 years. This fact is worth holding before moving forward, because it complicates the explanation that the Soviet system most needed to believe about itself after his death, the explanation that the crimes had been Stalin's crimes, that the framework was sound, that the problem had been the man rather than the structure the man had been operating inside. If the crimes were Stalin's crimes, the system should have recovered quickly once he was gone. 38 years of continued repression, continued surveillance, continued inability to acknowledge what the system was producing. This is not the trajectory of a system that had been temporarily distorted by one man and was now correcting itself. It is the trajectory of a system whose structural logic had not changed. The men who succeeded Stalin were not monsters in the way that later accounts sometimes require them to be. Khrushchev had genuine reformist instincts. Gorbachev had genuine idealism. Even Brezhnev, in the accounts of people who knew him, was a man who had been formed by a specific world and was trying to manage it, rather than a man who enjoyed what the management required. What they could not do, what the system made structurally impossible, was acknowledge that the framework itself had been the problem, because the framework was the only available justification for the system's existence. Khrushchev's secret speech of February 1956, delivered to the 20th Party Congress in a closed session, leaked within weeks, eventually published around the world, is one of the most remarkable political documents of the 20th century. Khrushchev stood at the podium and described, with a specificity that must have been physically uncomfortable for the people in the room, what had actually happened during the Great Terror. He named names. He described the torture. He read from documents. He told the delegates, many of whom had participated in the purges, had signed the denunciations, had voted to expel the people who were now being described as innocent victims, what they had been part of. The room was very quiet, and then Khrushchev explained what it meant. Stalin had deviated from Leninism. The crimes were Stalin's crimes, not the revolution's crimes. The cult of personality, the specific pathology of one man's ego applied to a system that should have prevented it, had produced the distortion. The party, properly led, was still the custodian of historical truth. The framework was still correct. The denunciation preserved the framework by locating all the crimes in one man. This was politically necessary. Any more thorough accounting would have implicated too many of the people in the room, and the room included everyone who ran the country. It was also intellectually dishonest in a specific and important way. The crimes were not the consequence of Stalin's personal pathology applied to an otherwise sound system. They were the consequences of the system's structural logic applied by a man who understood that logic better than anyone else and was willing to follow it wherever it led. Khrushchev could not say this. Saying it would have been to say that the framework was wrong, which would have been to say that the party had no special authority, which would have been to say that the Soviet Union had no legitimate basis for its existence. So the framework was preserved. The crimes were attributed to the deviation. The deviation was named Stalin, and the party declared that it had corrected the deviation and returned to the correct path. The people who had been in the Gulag, or whose family members had been in the Gulag, or who had signed the denunciations that had sent people to the Gulag, they were now supposed to understand that this had been an error, not a system, that the error had been corrected, that the system was fine. Some of them found this easier to believe than others. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 demonstrated, within months of the secret speech, what the limits of de-Stalinization actually were. The Hungarians had heard Khrushchev say that the Stalinist system had been wrong. They concluded, reasonably, that the system should therefore be changed, that the party's monopoly on power, the secret police, the subordination of Hungarian national interest to Soviet imperial interest, should be revised in light of the admission that the previous 30 years had been a mistake. Soviet tanks entered Budapest in November 1956. Approximately 500 Hungarians were killed. The Nagy government, which had attempted to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact, was overthrown. Imre Nagy was later executed. The message was clear, and it did not require explanation. De-Stalinization meant the removal of Stalin's excesses, not the revision of the framework that had produced them. The party was still the custodian of historical truth. The socialist camp was still moving in the direction history required. Countries that tried to move in a different direction would be corrected. Prague, spring 1968, received the same correction. Alexander Dubček's attempt to build socialism with a human face to create a version of the socialist framework that acknowledged its own failures and incorporated political pluralism was ended by Warsaw Pact tanks in August. The Brezhnev Doctrine formalized the logic. Socialist countries could not be permitted to leave socialism, because socialism was the direction of history, and the direction of history could not be reversed by the choices of individual countries. This was not cynicism dressed as ideology. It was ideology that had arrived at a conclusion it could not escape from. If history has a direction, and if your state's legitimacy rests on being aligned with that direction, then a state that chooses a different direction is not exercising sovereignty. It is making an error, and errors, in a framework organized around scientific law, are corrected, not negotiated with. The decades that followed the crushing of Prague Spring are often described as stagnation, the Brezhnev era. The long gray years in which the Soviet system neither reformed itself nor collapsed, in which the official ideology continued to be performed while privately almost no one believed it. What those decades actually were, at the level of the framework, was a slow and mostly unacknowledged separation between the performance and the conviction. The performance was elaborate and compulsory. Party congresses passed resolutions affirming the correctness of the Marxist-Leninist analysis. Newspapers reported on the steady advance toward communism. Schools taught the laws of historical materialism as established fact. Citizens participated in May Day parades, voted in elections with one candidate, attended political education sessions whose content everyone in the room understood to be theater. The conviction had largely left the building. This was understood by almost everyone and acknowledged by almost no one, because acknowledging it carried costs that had not disappeared with Stalin. The Gulag of the 1970s was smaller and less lethal than the Gulag of the 1930s. The psychiatric hospitals where dissidents were confined diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia, a condition whose defining symptom was persistent disagreement with the Soviet system, were a more refined instrument. You did not merely disagree with the Soviet framework. You were, in the clinical vocabulary, the framework had developed for this purpose. Unable to engage with reality correctly, the logic was consistent with the framework's founding claim. If the framework is objectively correct and you persistently deny it, the most parsimonious explanation is that something is wrong with your capacity for rational thought. The framework had arrived. By the 1970s, at the point of diagnosing disagreement as illness, Nadezhda Mandelstam survived. Her husband, the poet Osip Mandelstam, did not. He was arrested in 1934 for writing a poem that mocked Stalin's 16 lines. Never published. Read aloud to a small group of friends, one of whom reported it. He was arrested again in 1938 and died in a transit camp near Vladivostok in December of that year, under circumstances that were not documented and could not be investigated. Nadezhda Mandelstam spent the following decades in internal exile, moving from city to city, memorizing her husband's poems so they would not be lost if the manuscripts were found and destroyed. She taught English. She kept her head down. She waited. After Stalin's death, after Khrushchev's speech, after the partial thaw that made certain things temporarily possible, she wrote 2 memoirs, Hope Against Hope and Hope Abandoned, that described, from the inside, what it had been like to live inside the Soviet framework while knowing what the framework was doing. The memoirs are not primarily political documents, though they contain devastating political observations. They are primarily a record of what it costs to maintain a private truth against a public lie for decades, the specific damage that double consciousness does to a person. The specific kind of integrity that survival under those conditions requires. And the specific kind of courage it takes to write it all down when the writing down is still, even in the 1960s, dangerous. She wrote it anyway. The books were circulated in samizdat self-published manuscripts, typed and retyped and passed from hand to hand, and eventually published abroad. They were read, in the Soviet Union, by people who understood what they described because they were living inside the same description. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in 1962 with Khrushchev's personal authorization as part of the de-Stalinization campaign, brought the Gulag into the public literary record for the first time. The Gulag Archipelago, the 3-volume history of the camp system, was circulated in samizdat from the early 1970s and published abroad in 1973. In 1974, the Soviet state expelled Solzhenitsyn from the country. The expulsion was not simply the repression of a dissident in the ordinary sense. It was the framework defending itself against the specific kind of evidence that it could not absorb, the systematic, documented, named and dated account of what the framework had actually produced, written by someone who had been inside it and had come out the other side still capable of writing. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 as the general secretary of a party that had been performing a belief it largely no longer held, in a system that was falling further behind the capitalist economies it had been competing with, governing a population that had developed a sophisticated collective understanding of the distance between official reality and actual reality. He was 54 years old. He had grown up entirely within the Soviet system. He had risen through it, been formed by it, believed in its fundamental premises while being aware that something had gone seriously wrong and needed to be corrected. His project, Glasnost and Perestroika, openness and restructuring, was not an attempt to dismantle the Soviet system. It was an attempt to save it by reforming it, to close the gap between the framework's promises and the state's performance by acknowledging the gap publicly and mobilizing the society's intelligence and energy in addressing it. This required, in practice, allowing things to be said publicly that had previously only been said privately. And once those things were being said publicly, once the gap between the official version and the actual version was no longer maintained by the threat of consequences, the gap turned out to be much larger than Gorbachev had anticipated. The archives that were opened did not reveal a system that had deviated from a sound foundation. They revealed a system in which the foundation and the deviation had been the same thing all along. The question that the framework had never been able to answer honestly what had actually happened, and why turned out, when answered honestly, to not leave much of the framework standing. What Gorbachev discovered, what the events of 1989 through 1991 demonstrated with the particular speed of things that have been under enormous pressure for a very long time, was something about the relationship between the framework and the state that he had not fully understood when he began. The Soviet Union was not a nation in the ordinary sense. It was not held together by ethnic identity, or shared history in the pre-revolutionary sense, or geographic necessity, or the accumulated weight of centuries of common experience. It was held together by ideology, by the claim that the framework was correct, that the state that embodied the framework was therefore legitimate, and that the legitimacy of the state justified its existence as a single political entity. When the framework lost its authority, when Glasnost allowed the gap between the official version and the actual version to be publicly acknowledged, the state lost its rationale for existing in the form it had taken. The constituent republics had not been choosing to be part of the Soviet Union. They had been administered as part of it, in the name of a framework that now could not defend its own premises. When the framework fell, The administration became visible as administration as power without justification, and the republics began leaving. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990. Latvia and Estonia followed. Ukraine held a referendum in December. 1,991. 92% voted for independence. On December 25. Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor was raised. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics ceased to exist. 74 years after Lenin stepped off a sealed train at Finland Station and told the crowd that the worldwide socialist revolution had begun. What the framework left behind is not a simple question and does not have a clean answer, which is itself part of the point. The end of the Soviet Union is often read as the final proof that the framework was wrong, the historical refutation of Marxism, the vindication of capitalism, the end of history in Fukuyama's famous formulation. This reading is understandable. It is also incomplete in ways that the subsequent 3 decades have made more visible. The problems that Marx identified, the relationship between economic power and political power, the tendency of capital to concentrate, the capacity of economic structures to generate the ideologies that justify them, the systematic gap between what a society produces and what the people who produce it receive, did not disappear when the Soviet state collapsed. They are present in the world today with a clarity that would not have surprised Marx, even if the specific form they take would have surprised him considerably. What the Soviet experience demonstrated was not that Marx's analysis of capitalism was simply wrong. It demonstrated that the specific political conclusion drawn from that analysis, that the laws of history pointed toward a particular destination and that a vanguard party was entitled to use any means necessary to reach it, was catastrophically wrong, in ways that the structural features of the framework had made impossible to acknowledge from inside it. The analysis was serious. The law was not. And the difference between those two things, between an analysis that acknowledges its own contingency and a law that cannot, is the difference between a political program that can be reformed and a prophecy that can only be defended. The Soviet framework could only be defended. 74 years of defense, at a cost that the full accounting of which is still ongoing. This season has now examined 5 prophetic frameworks, and the Soviet case is the last of the 5 for a reason. Not because it is the largest, though its death toll rivals any. Not because it is the most recent, though it is. But because it introduces something that none of the previous 4 cases had. And that changes the analysis of all of them retroactively. It introduces the prophetic claim that does not know it is a prophecy. Before getting to that, the same thing that has been said in every episode needs to be said here. These 5 cases differ in ways that matter morally, and that no structural analysis dissolves. Manifest destiny was the ideology of conquest by a dominant power over peoples with less power. The Nazi framework was genocide. Organized and industrial, the Mahdist movement was colonial resistance against an occupying force. The Taiping was a peasant uprising against a dynasty that was itself an instrument of foreign imperial interests. The Soviet framework was, at different moments and for different people, genuinely different things, a liberation project for millions who built it in good faith, and a system of terror for the millions it destroyed. These distinctions matter. They are not collapsed by identifying the structural pattern the cases share. What the structural pattern offers is an explanation of how each of these frameworks operated, how they absorbed confirmation, converted disconfirmation into evidence of the need for deeper commitment, and made themselves resistant to the normal mechanisms by which human institutions learn from their failures. And the Soviet case shows that operation in its most sophisticated and most dangerous form. Every religious prophecy retains one vulnerability that the prophet cannot close. You can reject it. You can look at Muhammad Ahmed on Abba Island and say, I do not accept this man's claim to divine authority. I do not believe he received a vision from God. The Hadith tradition on which his claim rests is contested, and I do not find the specific reading he uses convincing. This rejection is available to you. It carries social costs, political costs, in some contexts, lethal costs, but it is logically coherent. You can say it and remain a rational person. You cannot reject the laws of physics. If someone tells you that objects fall at a rate determined by gravitational acceleration, you cannot say, I do not accept the authority from which you receive this information. The information is not from an authority. It is from the structure of the world. Rejecting it does not make you a dissident. It makes you someone who cannot engage with reality. Marx's claim was not that he had received a revelation. His claim was that he had analyzed the historical evidence and discovered the law that governed it, the same kind of law that Newton had discovered in mechanics and Darwin in biology. The framework was not asking for faith. It was presenting conclusions. This is a more powerful claim than divine revelation, because it forecloses a different set of responses. When the prophetic claim is scientific, disagreement is not heresy. It is irrationality. It is being unable to follow the evidence to its conclusions. It is, in the vocabulary the Soviet state eventually developed, being objectively on the wrong side of history regardless of your subjective intentions, regardless of what you thought you were doing, regardless of what you had sacrificed in what you believed was the service of the revolution. Objectively, not because you chose wrongly, because you were wrong about reality. And people who are wrong about reality are not political opponents to be argued with. They are people with a problem of perception, of analysis, of class position distorting their ability to see clearly that requires correction. The psychiatric hospitals where Soviet dissidents were confined in the 1960s and 1970s were not simply a repressive measure in the ordinary sense. They were the framework's logic applied to its most persistent critics with the framework's own vocabulary. If the laws of history are objectively correct and you persistently deny them, the most parsimonious explanation is that something is wrong with your capacity for rational thought. The framework had diagnosed disagreement as illness. That is the endpoint of a prophetic claim dressed as science. Not burning heretics, treating patients. There is something else the Soviet case introduces that requires sitting with, because it is uncomfortable and because the discomfort is precisely the point. The Soviet framework attracted, over the course of its history, the genuine idealism of millions of people not only in the Soviet Union, but in the capitalist democracies it identified as its enemies. The intellectuals, workers, artists, and activists who believed in the Soviet project were not, in the main, fools or moral cowards. Many of them were among the most thoughtful and ethically serious people of their generations. They looked at the world available to them, the Depression, fascism, racial terror in the American South, imperial violence in Africa and Asia, a systematic exploitation that Marx had described and that was visible to anyone paying attention, and they concluded that the Soviet framework offered a better account of what was wrong with the world and a more credible path toward something better. They were wrong in ways that they could not. In many cases, I've known from inside their moment. The archives were sealed. The evidence of what the framework was producing was either suppressed or explained away through mechanisms the framework itself provided. The structure of the claim made the evidence that should have falsified it look, from inside, like evidence that the enemies were working harder than expected, which was the framework's standard explanation for every gap between promise and reality. This is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And the explanation matters because it describes a dynamic that is not specific to the Soviet case, the dynamic of a framework sincerely inhabited by people of genuine goodwill, whose sincerity makes the framework more powerful and whose goodwill makes the violence more durable. The people who ran the Gulag were not, in the main, sadists. They were people who believed in the revolution and understood their work as its defense. The interrogators who extracted false confessions from old Bolsheviks were not, in the main, cynics performing a role they privately found absurd. They were people who had decided that the party's verdict was more reliable than the prisoner's account of his own actions, that subjective innocence was less informative than objective class position. The framework did not require evil. It required certainty. The specific certainty of people who believed they understood the laws of history and were therefore entitled to act on that understanding. Without the friction of doubt and without the accountability of systems that permit dissent. That is a more disturbing conclusion than the alternative. Because evil can, in principle, be identified and excluded. Certainty is harder to argue with. Certainty has already incorporated the counter-arguments into its structure and found them wanting. Certainty does not leave a door open. The Mahdi's certainty built a state and held it against an empire for 15 years. Hong Shuchuan's certainty built a state that killed 20 million people, while its founder composed theology in a palace. Stalin's certainty, or the certainty of the framework that Stalin had learned to operate with exceptional skill, built a state that industrialized a continent, won the largest war in history, and ran the Gulag simultaneously. Certainty, in all these cases, was the engine. The framework provided the certainty. The prophecy made the framework feel like a law. The Soviet framework collapsed, not because it was falsified in the logical sense. It had long since made itself immune to logical falsification, but because it exhausted itself. The gap between what it promised and what it produced became, over 70 years, too wide to manage even with all the instruments of a totalitarian state. Internal emigration became too extensive. The performance became too unconvincing. The double consciousness that the system required private knowledge held alongside public performance of its opposite became too costly to maintain across a population that had been living inside it for 3 generations. Gorbachev's reforms did not cause the collapse. They revealed it. They removed the pressure that had been holding a structure that had already lost its internal integrity. And the structure fell quickly. In the end, after decades of appearing immovable, this is the pattern that appears across the history of prophetic movements when they finally end. Not gradual erosion, but sudden collapse. Because the performance of certainty conceals the erosion until the moment when the performance can no longer be sustained. The Khalifa fought for 14 months after the battle that destroyed his army. The Taiping continued issuing proclamations from a starving, besieged city. The Soviet Union continued holding May Day parades and printing 5-year plan targets until the year it ceased to exist. The performance is the last thing to go, because the performance is what the framework has become, not a conviction, but a habit, a set of phrases and rituals and institutional arrangements that continue to operate after the belief that originally animated them has quietly left. When Gorbachev allowed the performance to be questioned, the habit turned out not to be strong enough to hold the structure up. It fell in weeks. This season has been asking, across 5 episodes, what makes a prophetic framework powerful, durable, and dangerous? The Mahdi's case showed that a framework can run with almost nothing, no printing press, no cameras, no state if the gap it fills is real, and the claim is made with sufficient conviction. The Taiping case showed that a framework can eat itself from inside, that the same logic that makes a movement powerful also makes it unable to acknowledge its own failures, and that this inability can be more destructive than any external enemy. The Soviet case adds a third thing. The most dangerous form of the prophetic claim is the one that does not know it is a prophecy. The framework that presents itself as science, as objective law, as the conclusion that any rational person examining the evidence would be forced to reach this framework is harder to argue with, harder to reform. and harder to step outside of than any framework that acknowledges it is asking for faith. Because faith, at some point, can be withdrawn. You cannot withdraw your assent from the laws of physics. The Soviet framework told its adherents that they were not believers, that they were rational people following evidence to its conclusions, that the revolution was not a leap of faith but the logical outcome of a lawful historical process that they had been fortunate enough to understand, clearly enough to act on. The framework was wrong about this. It was a prophecy, a claim about the direction of history, built on a gap between what the world promised and what it delivered, wrapped in the vocabulary of inevitability, and furnished with an explanation for every failure that did not require revising the claim. It was a prophecy that called itself science. That is why it lasted 70 years. That is why it killed as many people as it did. And that is why, when it finally ended, the ending looked not like a refutation but like an exhaustion, a framework that had not been proven wrong so much as it had simply run out of the energy required to keep performing its own correctness in the face of everything that performance required ignoring. A man in a reading room in London in the 1840s, absolutely certain he had discovered the law that governed everything, right that the world needed changing, right that the economic structures of his time were producing suffering that was systematic and could be analyzed, right that the question of who owns the means of production is a question with consequences for everything else. Wrong that he had found a law. He had found an analysis. Analysis can be revised. Laws cannot. The people who inherited his analysis decided it was a law. The people who came after them built a state on that decision. The state lasted 74 years and killed millions of people in the name of a destination that the laws of history had made inevitable. The laws of history did not ask for their lives. The framework did. The reading room is still there. The chair is marked for tourists. The books are still on the shelves. Outside, the world he was analyzing is still producing the contradictions he identified. In forms he would have recognized and forms he would not. The analysis is still worth reading. The law was never real. The difference between those two things, between an analysis and a law, is the difference between a framework that learns and a framework that only defends. He called it a law. Everything that followed was the consequence of that one word.